the rack until the ink seemed to drip from nerves rather than pen, each letter a record of pain that no sentence could ever convey fully, and yet, that was only the beginning. What awaited him was not just death, but a spectacle of suffering refined through generations of public execution, a ceremonial cruelty designed to turn bodies into messages. In Tudor and early Stuart England, treason was not merely punished. It was ritualized. The condemned were not simply executed. They were transformed into warnings, every stage of their death choreographed to display the might of the crown and the futility of resistance. The legal sentence for treason was clear, precise, and nightmarish: to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. First, the victim would be dragged on a wooden hurdle through the mud and filth of the city streets, jeered by crowds, their flesh already bruised and broken before they even reached the scaffold. Then, once there, they would be hanged by the neck, but not to death. The drop was calculated, short enough to leave them gasping, twitching, alive. Cut down while still conscious, they were then subjected to the most obscene violence imaginable. Their abdomen was slit open, intestines pulled out and burned before their eyes, heart removed while still beating if the executioner was skilled or cruel enough. Finally, the lifeless remains were beheaded and dismembered. Each quarter of their bodies sent to the far reaches of the kingdom to rot in cages as a permanent, rotting reminder of the state's wrath. This was the fate that Guy Fawkes was meant to suffer. A death so vile that even hardened criminals feared it more than anything. And yet, Fawkes would escape it not by royal pardon or secret deal, but by one final act of defiance. On the morning of his execution, weakened beyond recognition, his face pale and sunken, he climbed the scaffold steps at Old Palace Yard. The crowd had gathered in a sick anticipation, eager to witness the slow unraveling of the phrase "the mother and child are doing well" even in agony, once so rare, had not celebrated as a miracle. Whether but by design the or sheer willpower, medieval as the news was ready and the executioner prepared to begin the belief that suffering was redemptive, that illness was punishment from God, he hurled himself from the gallows with such force that his neck snapped. Pain was not something to be cured; it was something to be endured. The sound of bone cracking echoed louder than any sermon. Of divine judgment, he died instantly, denying his captors the show they had so torture disguised itself as healing. The crowd gasped, not in sorrow, but in disappointment, deprived of their grotesque entertainment. The crown was robbed of its message, and history gained a legend not of martyrdom alone, but of calculated courage. What he escaped, few today truly understand. The term hanged, drawn, and quartered has been softened by time, reduced to a phrase in textbooks, but to live in the shadow of such a sentence was to know a terror beyond modern comprehension. In the Tower's stone chambers, where walls seemed to hum with old screams, the tools still speak. The rack's gears, once slick with sweat and blood, creaked under the weight of many secrets. The scavenger's daughter, a brutal compression device, forced the body inward, bones breaking inwardly, lungs collapsing slowly. The manacles, iron cuffs suspended from high ceilings, left men dangling for hours, shoulders tearing apart from the socket, the body's weight becoming its own executioner. Guy Fawkes endured all of this and more, not because he was the most dangerous, but because he represented an idea that the crown could not kill unless it humiliated the man who bore it. But sometimes humiliation breeds legend, and a man broken in body becomes immortal in memory. What's chilling is not only what Fawkes endured, but why it was permitted. The English justice system of the early 17th century was not blind, it was theatrical. Torture was spectacle. Pain was policy. The law was not separate from cruelty, but infused with it. In a world where power feared rebellion, fear itself became a form of control. A controlled fear executed with precision, crafted with psychological depth, every execution a ritual, every scaffold a stage, every broken body a message written in flesh. The gunpowder plot may have failed, but in its ashes burned a truth that rulers dreaded, that ideas, once ignited, cannot be hanged, drawn, or quartered. Fawkes's decision to jump was not cowardice. It was narrative control, a final act that stripped the authorities of their theater. His body may have broken, but the intended message of submission, of the crown's total control, collapsed with him. What followed his death was not silence, it was myth-making. The annual burning of his effigy, the fireworks, the chants of remember the 5th of November, they are not celebrations of the crown's victory. They are echoes of the fear it once held, a reminder that somewhere deep in history's shadows, a man once refused to let his death be written by another's hand. But before we leave this story behind, We must return to a single, chilling question. What does it say about a civilization that refines death into theater? What does it mean when justice becomes a pageant and torture becomes performance? When we remember Guy Fawkes, do we remember the man? Or the mask, do we honor his cause? Or the crown that killed it? The truth, as always, lives somewhere in the silence that followed the snap of his neck. Somewhere in the crowd's gasp. Somewhere beneath the stone floors of the tower, where old ghosts still whisper of men who would not kneel, and kings who feared the fire in their eyes. In the damp corridors of the Tower of London, where blood once mingled with rainwater and the walls remember every scream ever torn from a throat, history did not rest after Guy Fawkes. His defiance became legend, but his fate was no anomaly. It was part of a deeper, darker pattern that threaded through centuries of power. Because long before Fawkes was dragged through the streets, other bodies had already broken beneath the crown's gaze. And long after, they would continue to break. There is a reason why monarchs feared more than just rebellion. They feared truth, because truth once exposed carries with it a weight far heavier than any crown. And in the long shadows of Europe's grandest palaces, in hidden monasteries and plague-ridden alleyways, the human body became both battleground and instrument in a war between control and chaos. Let us descend now into the world of royal medicine, where privilege did not mean safety, and where the same bloodline that wore ermine robes also bled, rotted, and wept in silence. Because to be royal in medieval and early modern Europe wasn't to be invincible. It was to be trapped inside a body surrounded by superstition, leeches, mercury, and madness. Medicine, if it can even be called that, was a theater of desperation. Monarchs relied on physicians whose knowledge came not from science, but from astrology, humors, and ancient texts copied so many times they were barely legible. The most powerful men and women in the world entrusted their lives to potions made from crushed pearls, ground-up mummy flesh, and the urine of young boys. A king's illness was never just illness, it was a threat to the realm. And so, in their paranoia, rulers became test subjects in a macabre experiment. How far could human suffering stretch before death finally arrived, as mercy considered Charles II of England, a merry monarch whose final days were anything but merry? When he collapsed in his chambers in 1685, his royal physicians descended upon him like vultures in silk. Over the next 4 days, they drained him of nearly a gallon of blood, burned his skin with red-hot irons, forced him to swallow purgatives, emetics, and enemas laced with senna, antimony, and powdered human skull. He was blistered, bled, poisoned, purged, and finally drowned in a concoction of brandy and bezoar stone scraped from the intestines of goats. He died not from his illness, but from the desperate rituals of those trying to save him. His body, a once living symbol of divine right, was reduced to a battlefield, a canvas of agony painted with ignorance. And this was not uncommon. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, ruled for 72 years but spent much of that time rotting from within. A festering anal fistula made even sitting unbearable. But rather than admit weakness, he demanded surgery, a bold and gruesome move in an era before anesthesia. The operation, performed in 1686, involved slicing open the king's flesh and draining the infection while he remained fully awake. Courtiers later praised his stoic dignity, but no crown can stop pain. Not even his. These men, worshipped as gods on earth, lived in bodies ravaged by disease and destroyed by the very treatments meant to preserve them. Even Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, whose portraits showed porcelain skin and fire-red hair, spent her final years hiding the truth. Beneath the makeup made of lead and vinegar, her skin blistered and peeled. Her teeth blackened and fell out, her hair thinned to patches. Yet she wore the mask of power until the end, dying surrounded by silence, refusing to be touched, as though any gesture of comfort would expose her fragility. Royal courts did not allow weakness. Monarchs could not suffer. And yet they did, silently, brutally, and often alone. Because suffering was political, a king who coughed too long could inspire rebellion. A queen who bled too much could be declared cursed. So their agony was hidden behind velvet curtains, drowned in perfumes, and rewritten in courtly poems. But no scent could hide the stench of decay, and no light could erase what servants saw: kings shaking in fevers, queens screaming through miscarriages, and the slow death of dignity beneath layers of ritual and denial. Beyond the palaces, the common people fared no better. Medicine for the poor was a gamble with death. Barber surgeons pulled teeth with pliers caked in blood. Plague doctors stuffed their masks with herbs to block the smell of rot, thinking it would protect them from disease. Madness was exorcised, not treated. Seizures were blamed on demons. And childbirth, one of the most common experiences for women, was often fatal. The phrase "the mother and child are doing well" was once so rare it was celebrated as a miracle. But perhaps the darkest layer of medieval medicine was not physical, it was spiritual. The belief that suffering was redemptive, that illness was punishment from God, shaped treatment across all classes. Pain was not something to be cured, it was something to be endured, a sign of guilt, of divine judgment, of sin made flesh. And so, torture disguised itself as healing. If you were mad, you were bled. If you were epileptic, you were chained. If you were melancholic, your womb was believed to have wandered your body and needed to be smoked back into place. Women in particular bore the brunt of this medical madness. Labeled as hysterical, sinful, or cursed, they were silenced not just by society but by the very hands that were supposed to heal them. Thousands were branded witches simply for possessing herbs, midwifery skills, or too much knowledge. The church and the state feared their power, and so they were burned, drowned, and broken. Medicine became yet another battlefield in the war against women's autonomy. And behind every healing hand, there was a dagger sharpened by ignorance and wielded with conviction. Even today, the echoes of this horror remain. We speak of the royal touch as if it were magical. We romanticize medieval remedies in fiction, but the truth is far colder. It is the sound of steel scraping bone, the sight of a monarch's skin blistering beneath a poultice, the smell of disease cloaked in incense. It is a history written not in textbooks, but in the scars left behind, and in every scar, a story, a secret, one that history tried to bury beneath thrones, cathedrals, and crowns. But pain, like truth, never stays buried forever. It rises, it festers, it whispers. Just as the tower remembers Guy Fawkes, the body remembers too. And when the mask of royalty cracks, it reveals what lies beneath, not gods, not saviors, just flesh. Just fear, just fragile, bleeding history. They say time buries all things, but the bones tell a different story. In places where ancient cities once breathed beneath layers of ash, stone, and forgotten soil lie secrets far older than kings and queens. Secrets of civilizations swallowed by time, wiped from memory not by accident, but often by intention. And though their temples have crumbled and their gods turned to dust, the silence left behind still pulses with questions. Who were they, really, and what did they do to deserve erasure? To understand the darkness of our past, we must go further back, not just to forgotten medicine or tortured traders, but to entire societies that vanished as if the earth itself conspired to make them disappear. And often, that erasure wasn't nature's work, it was human. Because sometimes, the greatest threat to power is memory, and when the powerful rewrite history, they begin by burning the names of those who dared to live outside the sanctioned story. Deep in the Andes, there is a place that once ruled empires with no written language, no wheels, and no metal currency, only thread. The Inca, masters of an empire that stretched for thousands of miles, controlled it all with something called quipu, knotted cords strung together in sequences so complex they rival modern code. These were not just tools of trade, they were the empire's memory, census, laws, rituals, victories. Every knot held meaning, every string a story. But when the Spanish arrived, they saw only savagery. They burned the quipu, destroyed the temples, and executed the priests who remembered how to read the chords. The knowledge was not lost by time, it was strangled in its sleep, deliberately silenced so that no one would ever challenge the new story, that history began with conquest, and that all before it was shadow. But shadows have weight, and if you listen long enough, they start to speak. Far across the ocean, buried beneath the jungles of Central America, another story lay hidden for centuries. The Maya civilization, often reduced to calendars and pyramids, understood the stars better than most modern astronomers. They tracked eclipses, mapped Venus with terrifying accuracy, and aligned their cities with celestial bodies in ways that still defy full understanding. But for all their brilliance, they too were consumed by war, by drought, by betrayal. And when Spanish conquistadors arrived, they did what conquerors always do. They found the codices, books written in a language of glyphs and gods, and they burned them. All but 3 survived. 3. The rest became ash in the name of salvation. because what better way to claim dominion over a people than to erase their memory? The Mayas' rituals, beliefs, their entire philosophy of time all reduced to myth and mistranslation. To this day, most of what we think we know is patchwork interpreted through the lens of those who destroyed them. Imagine that. Imagine your entire civilization reduced to footnotes written by your executioner. But not all forgotten truths were buried by conquest. Some were sealed away by the hands of their own creators, locked behind doors never meant to be opened. In medieval Europe, hidden beneath monasteries and castles, rituals were performed that no one dared speak of outside stone walls. These were not ceremonies of light, they were acts of desperation, fear, and control. We like to think of medieval Christianity as a monolith, one unified body marching to the rhythm of Scripture. But in the cracks of that system, something far more human lived: priests who practiced astrology in secret, alchemists who whispered Latin incantations while distilling mercury, monks who copied forbidden texts by candlelight, shielding their eyes from the knowledge they preserved, knowledge that could get them excommunicated, or worse. Some of these rituals bordered on madness, bloodletting not just for health, but to purge sin from the veins, self-flagellation to invite divine visions. And in the deepest chambers, whispers of something darker, rites that promise glimpses beyond the veil, at the price of the soul. These weren't just spiritual practices, they were survival. In a world where famine, plague, and death were daily visitors, the line between faith and fear blurred. And when people are desperate enough, even the devout turn to the unthinkable. Evidence of this still surfaces in bones arranged in pentagrams beneath cathedral floors, in frescoes hastily whitewashed when inquisitors came knocking, in the strange books that scholars still find hidden inside false walls, books bound in human skin, pages inked with blood, and always, always, the silence surrounding them. As if history itself is embarrassed by what it once did in the dark. Even royalty, wrapped in silks and drenched in incense, were not immune to this hunger for forbidden power. Queen Isabella of Castile, remembered for unifying Spain, kept a personal collection of alchemical manuscripts hidden from court. Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire filled his palace with occultists, magicians, and astrologers more than generals. He believed the stars would guide his empire. Instead, he lost it. And then there are the legends too strange to be false. Stories of babies born with teeth, hidden from public view. Of secret chambers built beneath royal nurseries, where omens were read from dreams and organs. And of kings whose advisors included men who claimed to speak with angels while holding knives behind their backs. But perhaps the most disturbing truths are those we carry without even realizing it. Rituals we call tradition that once began as blood rites. Symbols on flags and coats of arms that were once emblems of cults. Nursery rhymes whispered to children that are echoes of execution songs. London Bridge is falling down, ring around the rosy, harmless lullabies, until you look closer. Until you realize the ring was a symptom of the plague. The rosy was the rash, and the ashes weren't metaphor. We inherit these things not knowing their weight. And that is how the darkest histories survive, not by being remembered, but by being repeated, disguised, hollowed out, made palatable. But the truth remains, it always does. In the silence between rituals, in the void left by burned libraries, in the cracks of palace walls where forgotten names still echo, asking to be heard. History is not just what we remember. It's what we choose to forget, and in that forgetting, we lose more than facts. We lose warnings. We lose mirrors. So the next time you hear a name in passing etched on a monument, buried in a footnote, or muttered in an old story, listen closely. Ask who erased it. Ask why. Because the past is not dead. It's not even past. It's alive. It walks with us. Beneath the cities we build, inside the books we burn, and behind the masks we wear, to feel safe.